The storm in the town square. The sun climbed higher in the crisp morning sky, casting long shadows across Maplewood Town Square. Despite the warm hues of light, the air carried an undercurrent of tension, the kind that unsettled those who passed through. Helen Williams, a soft-spoken woman in her early 60s, walked with a purpose across the cobblestones, her handmade satchel clutched close. She was a fixture of the community, known for her artisan jewelry, a craft she had spent decades perfecting after the untimely loss of her husband. Today, she was en route to deliver a special order to a local shop. Helen's steps faltered as she heard the blare of a police siren. Glancing back, she saw a patrol car slow to a crawl behind her. A stocky officer with sharp features, Officer Bradley, stepped out. His demeanor was imposing, and his face held an expression Helen had come to recognize, a mix of suspicion and disdain. "You." His voice cut through the morning hum like a blade. Helen turned, startled. "Me?" she asked, clutching her bag tighter. "Yes, you," Bradley snapped, closing the distance between them. "What are you doing out here?" Helen straightened, trying to muster courage. "I'm delivering an order to Betty's boutique," she replied evenly, gesturing to the row of shops ahead. Bradley's eyes narrowed, his gaze flitting to her satchel. "Betty's boutique. That's by the bank, isn't it? Funny you're wandering so close to a place that just reported some suspicious activity." Confusion crossed Helen's face. "I haven't been near the bank." "Sure you haven't," Bradley retorted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Why don't you show me what's in the bag?" A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs carrying a mix of curiosity and concern. Helen hesitated, glancing around at the onlookers. She felt the sting of humiliation rise in her chest, but reminded herself to stay calm. "It's just my jewelry pieces," she said, her voice firm but polite. "I sell them to make a living." Bradley smirked, a cruel gleam in his eye. "Jewelry pieces. Let's see." Reluctantly, Helen unzipped her bag and began pulling out its contents, small boxes of intricately designed earrings, necklaces, and bracelets. Among them was a tin of delicate glass beads she used for custom orders. Bradley picked up the tin, shaking it. "What's this?" "Tools for breaking into safes," he accused. Helen's eyes widened. "No, those are for making jewelry. Please." "Save it," Bradley interrupted, his voice growing louder. "Do you think you can waltz around this town like you own it? We've got rules here, and people like you don't get to break them." Helen's heart raced. "I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, her voice trembling but steady. By now, the crowd's murmurs had grown louder. Some were visibly upset, while others watched silently, unsure of what to do. A young woman called out, "She's just a jewelry maker. Leave her alone." Another man added, "This isn't right." Bradley's jaw tightened as he turned to the crowd. "Stay back," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." Turning back to Helen, he stepped closer, towering over her. "Eat it," he said, holding up the tin of beads. Helen blinked, stunned. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Eat it, or maybe you'd prefer I take you downtown for resisting arrest." The air was thick with disbelief. The crowd gasped, some shouting in protest, but no one dared to step forward. Helen's mind reeled as humiliation and fear clashed within her. She had always been taught to remain composed, to stay calm in the face of adversity. But this was too much. "I won't do it," Helen said, her voice shaking but resolute. Bradley's smirk faltered, replaced by a cold glare. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Then maybe you'd like to see how far I can take this." Before Helen could respond, a deep voice rang out, cutting through the chaos like thunder. "What's going on here?" The crowd turned as one, parting to reveal a man striding toward them with a commanding presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. His face was a mixture of controlled anger and steely determination. As he approached, his gaze locked onto Bradley, who visibly stiffened. "Who the hell are you?" Bradley demanded, his bravado faltering. The man ignored the question, instead focusing on Helen. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked gently. Helen nodded, tears threatening to spill as she recognized the man. It was her son, Marcus Williams, a prominent judge who had recently returned to their hometown. Marcus turned back to Bradley, his expression hardening. "Officer, do you even know who you're talking to?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. Bradley hesitated, his confidence slipping. "She was acting suspiciously near the bank," he stammered. "I was just doing my job." "By threatening her and forcing her to eat glass," Marcus countered, his voice sharp. The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by his presence. Bradley faltered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. I didn't mean." Marcus stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Enough. You've crossed a line, and there will be consequences." The square was silent now, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Helen's trembling hand reached out to her son, who grasped it firmly, a silent promise of protection. The crowd watched, their breath held as they waited to see how the confrontation would unfold. But one thing was clear: this was no longer just about Helen or Bradley. It was about justice, and Marcus was determined to deliver it. Unmasking the uniform. The square remained silent, the tension thick as Marcus's words hung in the air. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his bluster cracking under the weight of the judge's gaze. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him before a single syllable escaped. "Not another word," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding. "We're going to settle this here, in front of the people who witnessed your actions. No backtracking. No excuses." The crowd murmured their agreement, emboldened by Marcus's presence. Helen, standing beside her son, felt a mixture of relief and unease. While she trusted Marcus completely, she knew how dangerous it was to confront men like Bradley, men who wielded their power recklessly and without accountability. Bradley sneered, attempting to recover some semblance of authority. "I don't need to explain myself to you. I'm an officer of the law." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "And I am a judge, sworn to uphold that same law. What you've done here is not only unethical, it's criminal." The crowd gasped. Whispers of support rippled through the onlookers, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Bradley glanced nervously at the cameras now pointed in his direction. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, stepping back as though to retreat. "Oh, you're not going anywhere," Marcus said firmly, stepping into his path. His towering frame was a clear warning. "Not until you're held accountable for your actions." Bradley's face turned red with anger and humiliation. "You're making a big mistake," he hissed. "You don't know who you're messing with." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who hides behind a badge to bully and demean those he's supposed to protect." The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of agreement. Helen looked on, her heart swelling with pride at her son's bravery. But a part of her still feared what might come next. She had seen enough injustice in her lifetime to know that the system didn't always favor the truth. Bradley, cornered and desperate, tried one last gambit. "She was loitering near the bank," he said loudly, as though trying to convince the crowd. "I was doing my job, protecting this community." Marcus folded his arms, unimpressed. "Loitering? She was walking to a shop to deliver her handmade jewelry. And even if she were standing near the bank, that's hardly a crime, is it?" Bradley stammered, struggling to find an argument. Marcus didn't give him the chance. And then, Marcus continued, his voice rising. "You accused her of carrying tools for a crime because of these." He held up the small tin of glass beads, turning them in the sunlight so they sparkled. "Jewelry-making beads. You tried to force her to eat them. Tell me, Officer Bradley, how does that fit into protecting this community?" The officer had no answer. The crowd grew louder, their anger palpable. Cries of "shame on you," and abuse of power echoed across the square. Bradley's face paled as he realized there was no escape. Marcus wasn't just holding him accountable, he was dismantling every shred of authority Bradley thought he had. Suddenly, a voice called out from the back of the crowd. "I've seen him do this before." Heads turned as an older man stepped forward, his weathered face lined with anger. "Last month, he harassed my grandson for standing outside the library after hours. No crime, no reason, just an excuse to flex his power." Another voice joined in. "He stopped my niece for walking home from work. Said she fit the description of someone who'd committed a robbery, but wouldn't say who or where." One by one, more people came forward, recounting their experiences with Officer Bradley. Each story painted the picture of a man who had long since abandoned the principles of his badge. Marcus listened intently, his expression grim. When the testimonies quieted, he turned back to Bradley, who was now visibly trembling. "It seems this isn't the first time you've crossed the line," Marcus said, his tone sharp. "But I'll make sure it's the last." Before Bradley could respond, Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call. "This is Judge Marcus Williams. I need the Chief of Police at Maplewood Town Square immediately. We have an officer who needs to be relieved of duty." The crowd erupted in cheers, their faith in justice momentarily restored. Bradley looked as though he might faint, his bravado fully drained. Helen reached for her son's hand, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you, Marcus." He squeezed her hand gently. "No one should go through what you just did, Mom. Not ever." The square buzzed with energy as people began sharing their stories with each other, united in their determination to see justice served. But as the Chief of Police arrived, flanked by other officers, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The storm in the square might have passed, but the battle for true accountability was far from over. The chains of power. The murmurs of the crowd shifted to a heavy silence as the Chief of Police, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair named Chief Simmons, stepped into the square. His badge caught the sunlight, gleaming like a beacon of authority. Behind him were two other officers, their expressions unreadable but their presence clear. This was not a casual visit. Marcus turned to meet Simmons, his posture unwavering. "Chief," Marcus greeted him curtly. "We have a situation that demands immediate attention." Simmons's eyes flicked from Marcus to the visibly shaken Officer Bradley, then to Helen, who stood resolutely beside her son. He sighed heavily. "Judge Williams," he said, his voice a mix of politeness and fatigue. "I've received your call. Can you explain exactly what's happening here?" Marcus gestured toward Bradley. "This officer has not only harassed an innocent woman, but also threatened her with an act of humiliation, forcing her to eat glass beads under the pretense of law enforcement. Furthermore, it appears he has a pattern of abusive behavior, as corroborated by multiple witnesses here today." Simmons's face darkened as he processed the information. He turned to Bradley, his tone sharp. "Is this true, officer?" Bradley, still flustered, tried to regain his composure. "Chief, I was doing my job. She was acting suspicious near the bank, and I had to investigate." "By threatening her?" Simmons pressed, his voice rising slightly. "By trying to force her to eat jewelry-making beads. Do you understand how that looks?" "I was under pressure," Bradley blurted out, his voice cracking. "This town has been on edge lately. I might have overreacted." The crowd erupted in anger at his weak defense. Cries of "overreacted," "and that's not an excuse," rang out. Simmons raised a hand to quiet them but did little to quell their fury. Marcus stepped forward. "Chief Simmons, overreaction doesn't justify this behavior. This man has used his position to bully and intimidate, not protect. If we're going to uphold the principles of justice, then he must be held accountable." Simmons nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You're right, Judge. Officer Bradley, hand me your badge and your weapon." Bradley froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What? You're suspended. Effective immediately, pending an internal investigation, Simmons said firmly. And from the sound of it, you're lucky if that's all that happens. Bradley's hands shook as he unpinned his badge and unholstered his weapon. The crowd watched in a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Some cheered softly, but others remained quiet, their faces reflecting the reality that this was only the first step toward justice. As Simmons collected the items, Marcus turned to the crowd. This isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allows people like him to thrive. I encourage every single one of you who has faced injustice to come forward. Submit your statements, your evidence. The only way we can change this is by shining a light on it. His words were met with applause and nods of agreement. People began to exchange stories more openly, forming small groups to discuss their experiences. The atmosphere shifted from tense to energized, a community finding its voice after years of silence. Meanwhile, Simmons pulled Marcus aside. "Judge, I appreciate what you've done here today, but I have to warn you, this is going to ruffle some feathers. Bradley isn't just some rogue officer. He has connections." Marcus's expression hardened. Connections don't absolve him of his actions. If anything, they make it even more critical that we address this. Simmons sighed. "I'll do my part, but you know how these things work. There will be pushback." "I'm prepared for that," Marcus replied. "Are you?" Simmons hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll stand by you, but we need to move carefully." As the chief walked away, Marcus returned to his mother, who was quietly observing the scene. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked gently. Helen looked up at her son, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes steady. "I'll be fine, Marcus," she said. "But I'm not the only one who's been hurt by this. I'm proud of what you've done, but this is bigger than me." "I know," Marcus said, "and I promise I won't stop until the whole truth comes out." The square began to clear as people dispersed, some heading to the police station to file complaints, others returning to their daily lives, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Helen and Marcus stood together, a quiet moment of solidarity amidst the chaos. But as they left the square, neither could shake the feeling that the fight was just beginning. Behind the scenes, forces were already mobilizing to protect their own, and Marcus knew the road ahead would be anything but smooth. The chains of power ran deep in this town, but Marcus was determined to break them, one link at a time. Beneath the surface, the morning after the confrontation in the square, Maplewood felt different. The usual calm that characterized the town had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension. The people of the square had spoken, but Marcus knew that the fight for justice wasn't going to be as simple as confronting a rogue officer. The system that allowed Officer Bradley's behavior wasn't isolated. It was ingrained in the very fabric of the town's infrastructure, and those who benefited from it wouldn't go down without a fight. Helen sat quietly at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the cup. Marcus watched her, concern etching deep lines on his face. She had been through so much, and though her outward calm was a source of strength, he could see the strain in her eyes. "Mom, you don't have to worry about Bradley," Marcus said, sitting across from her. "We're going to make sure he's held accountable." Helen looked up at her son, a faint smile touching her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know, Marcus. But it's not just him, is it? It's the system that protects him. Bradley's just the face of something much bigger." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "I've been thinking about that too. The more I dig, the more I realize that the corruption runs deeper than just one officer." Helen placed her cup down and leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned back, his fingers tapping the table. "Bradley isn't an isolated case. He's part of a network of officers who have used their positions to manipulate situations, intimidate citizens, and shield their actions behind a badge. I've been in this town long enough to know that this isn't the first time someone has turned a blind eye to this kind of behavior." Helen's face darkened. "How deep does it go, Marcus?" "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted, "but I intend to find out. I've already started reaching out to some of my contacts in the judicial system. There are rumors that certain people in positions of power have been looking the other way for years. It's not just the police, it's politicians, local business owners, even some judges. Helen's eyes widened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. Are you saying that even the courts are compromised? Marcus hesitated, the weight of his words hanging heavy. I'm not sure, but there are signs. What happened with Bradley was just the beginning. If we want to make real change, we're going to have to confront a lot of powerful people. Helen was quiet for a long moment, the words sinking in. She had lived in Maplewood her whole life, raised her son here, and had always believed in the inherent goodness of the town. But now, as the cracks in the town's facade began to show, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I've known you were destined for this kind of work, Marcus, she said, her voice steady. But it won't be easy. They'll try to bury you, try to make you look like the villain. You have to be ready for that. I know, Mom, Marcus replied, his voice firm. But I'm not backing down. I won't let them hide behind their positions of power any longer. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Marcus stood and walked to the door, opening it to reveal a young woman standing on the porch, her face tense. She was holding a manila envelope, and her eyes darted nervously around the street. Marcus Williams, she asked quietly. Yes, that's me, he said, stepping aside to allow her in. She handed him the envelope. This is for you. I've got more information for you. The kind of information you need to expose them. Marcus opened the envelope carefully. Inside were several documents, including photos of Officer Bradley meeting with shady individuals late at night. There were receipts for large cash withdrawals and what appeared to be encrypted phone records. As he scanned the papers, the truth began to take shape. A network of corrupt officers, politicians, and business leaders who had been working together to manipulate the town for their benefit. Where did you get this? Marcus asked, his voice low with awe. The young woman hesitated, glancing around as though making sure no one was watching. I've been following Bradley for a while. He's been doing things, illegal things, but I couldn't get close enough until now. I'm tired of being afraid, Judge Williams. I want to help expose them. Marcus studied her carefully. Why the secrecy? Why the risk? Her eyes flickered with a mix of fear and determination. Because they know who I am. I've seen things they don't want anyone to see. If I'd gone to the police with this, I would have been silenced. But you're a judge. You can make a difference. You have the power to expose them. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind racing as he processed the information. Thank you. You've done the right thing. She gave him a tight nod before turning and walking quickly back down the porch, disappearing into the quiet street. Marcus closed the door and turned to his mother, holding up the stack of papers. This is just the beginning, Mom. Bradley's connections go further than I thought. And now I've got the proof. Helen's face was a mixture of pride and concern. You need to be careful, Marcus. You've already made enemies. They'll try to come after you. If you go down this road, there's no turning back. I know, Marcus said, his voice resolute. But I can't turn back. Not now. Not after everything that's happened. As Marcus sifted through the documents, a plan began to form in his mind. This was no longer just about Bradley. It was about the system that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. The town of Maplewood had been built on the illusion of order and fairness, but now it was clear that beneath the surface, a far more sinister reality had been lurking for years, and Marcus was going to bring it all to light. The next steps wouldn't be easy. In fact, they would be dangerous. But with the evidence now in his hands, he knew that there was no turning back. He would face down the powerful forces that had held this town in a chokehold for far too long, whatever it took. The silent war. The days following Marcus's discovery of the incriminating documents were filled with both anticipation and caution. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Photos of Bradley meeting with known criminals, phone records hinting at illegal transactions, and receipts that clearly linked powerful figures to the underworld of Maplewood. But Marcus knew that exposing the truth wasn't just a matter of revealing these secrets. It was about survival. The town was on edge. News of Bradley's suspension had spread like wildfire. And while many celebrated the small victory, others whispered about what would come next. Those who benefited from the status quo were preparing for a battle, and Marcus knew it would be more than just a legal struggle. It would be a battle for his life, his career, and his family's future. Late one evening, as Marcus sat in his dimly lit office, carefully reviewing the evidence, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an anonymous number. "They know what you're doing. They'll come for you. Be ready." His heart skipped a beat. He'd expected resistance. But this felt different. This was a warning. A threat, perhaps, but also an invitation. It was a message meant to unsettle him, to push him into making a mistake. Whoever they were, they weren't going to let Marcus dismantle the system without a fight. Marcus's fingers hovered over the screen as he debated his next move. He knew this wasn't just about Bradley or the police. It was about a network, a carefully woven web of influence, power, and fear. Whoever controlled the strings had the ability to destroy his reputation, his career, and even his life. But Marcus wasn't going to back down. He had his mother's strength, and his own resolve was ironclad. The people who had been victims of this corrupt system were counting on him. They needed someone to stand up for them, to tear down the walls of secrecy and expose the ugliness that lurked within Maplewood. Still, Marcus knew that he couldn't do this alone. He spent the next few hours making calls, secret calls to a small group of trusted allies within the judicial system, as well as a few key people in the media who had long been suspicious of the local authorities. They agreed to meet the following evening at a discreet location to discuss their next steps. The meeting place was a small, unassuming diner on the outskirts of town, known to only a few people. It was dimly lit, with an air of quiet anonymity. Marcus walked in, his eyes scanning the room before settling on a corner booth where his allies had gathered. He sat down, nodding in acknowledgement. "Glad you could make it, Marcus," said Carl, a former investigative reporter who had seen firsthand the darker sides of Maplewood's power structure. He was now working on the inside of a local news outlet, but had kept his connections within the investigative world. His face was weathered, a reflection of years spent exposing corruption and fighting to get the truth to the public. "Let's get straight to it," Marcus said, leaning in. "I've got the proof. Bradley's connections are just the beginning. There's a whole network we need to expose, starting with the higher-ups in the police department, but we can't stop there." "Agreed," Carl replied. "We've seen what's been happening under the surface, but the real challenge is getting the public to believe it. They're already trying to bury this. We need to show them that the corruption goes all the way to the top." "Exactly," Marcus said. "And we need to be strategic. One wrong move, and this could all fall apart. I've seen how this town's leaders will protect their own at any cost. If we want to win, we need to be smarter than they are." Their conversation continued, strategizing their next steps. They decided to leak key pieces of the evidence to trusted journalists who could report on it without fear of retribution. But even as they planned, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took would be watched. The town's power players were likely already aware of what was happening. There would be no simple confrontation. This would be a silent war fought in the shadows. As the meeting ended and Marcus stepped out into the cool night, he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had made the first move, but he knew that those in power wouldn't let it go unchallenged. The real danger was just beginning. The following days were filled with a series of quiet, calculated moves. Information was leaked, carefully timed to ensure that the right people would see it without tipping off the wrong ones. The public's reaction was mixed. Some embraced the revelation of corruption, while others were more skeptical, unsure if they could trust the sources. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself growing more isolated. Trusted allies were careful not to be seen with him in public, and his every move was scrutinized. He knew the threats were coming, and it wasn't just Bradley or his corrupt associates. It was the town itself, the system he had spent years upholding, the very system he had come to realize was broken beyond repair. One evening, as Marcus returned home, he found a small package waiting on his doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. He opened it carefully, his heart racing. Inside, he found a single black envelope, sealed with wax. When he broke the seal, he found a note that simply read, "You've made your choice. There will be consequences. We'll be watching." His blood ran cold. He had known the risks, but this was different. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They were making it personal. Marcus stared at the note, his mind racing. He had gone too far to turn back now. If this was a warning, it wasn't enough to stop him. It was just another sign that he was on the right path. The silent war had begun in earnest. There was no going back. This battle would define not only his future but the future of Maplewood itself, and Marcus was prepared to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The price of truth. The days following the chilling note brought an eerie sense of foreboding to Marcus's every step. Despite the mounting threats, his resolve remained unshaken. The small town of Maplewood, once a place he thought of as safe and familiar, had become a battlefield where the truth hung like a fragile thread, ready to snap under the weight of the powerful forces conspiring against him. The pressure was mounting from all sides. He knew that the risks were growing with each piece of evidence he shared, each story that made its way to the media. He was no longer just a judge seeking justice. He was now an enemy of those who had spent decades crafting a system of power and privilege. And they weren't about to let one man, no matter how well-placed, tear it all down. As Marcus sat in his office late one evening, reviewing more files, the door to his office creaked open. It was his mother, her face drawn with worry, but her eyes steady. She had never been one to show fear, but tonight, something in her demeanor made Marcus pause. "Marcus," she began softly, her voice edged with concern. "I know you're determined, but this isn't just about what's right anymore. They're going to come after you harder now." He stood, walking to the window and looking out over the quiet town. "I know, Mom. I've received another warning. They know what I'm doing, and they're getting more brazen with their threats." Helen sighed deeply. "I never wanted you to be in the spotlight like this. You've always been so focused on the law, on doing what's fair. But sometimes, doing the right thing isn't just about the law. It's about survival." Marcus turned back to face her, his expression determined. "I know the risks, Mom. But I can't walk away now. Not after everything that's happened. Not after what they did to you in that square. They crossed a line, and I won't let them get away with it." His words were firm, and though Helen could hear the strain beneath them, she knew better than to argue with him now. Her son had always been steadfast, but this fight was different. It wasn't just about one officer or one act of corruption. This was a war against an entire system, and Marcus had become its battleground. "I just want you to be careful," Helen said quietly. "You've got people in your corner, but you also have enemies who will do anything to stop you. And they're not just ordinary people. They're the ones who have been controlling this town for years." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He knew what she meant. He had uncovered links between Bradley and local politicians, business leaders, even members of the judiciary who were willing to turn a blind eye to illegal activities. The web was vast, and it was only a matter of time before the true extent of their influence became apparent. But it wasn't just about exposing the corruption. It was about dismantling it piece by piece, a task that would require patience, strategy, and most likely, sacrifices. The phone on his desk rang, breaking the tense silence. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the caller ID. It was Carl, the investigative reporter who had been helping him gather information. "Marcus," Carl said quickly, his voice low and urgent. "We've got a problem. Someone's been leaking the information to the wrong people." We've got reason to believe that Bradley's allies in the police department are actively sabotaging the story. They've got people on the inside, and they're trying to discredit the evidence before it goes public. How bad is it? Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern. Bad. They've been using the media to paint you as a target. They're making it look like you've overstepped. They're trying to turn the public against you. If we don't act fast, they'll have enough momentum to bury this whole thing. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The news didn't surprise him. It only confirmed what he'd feared. The corruption was deep, and now the people behind it were fighting back. He could feel the walls closing in around him. We need to move quickly, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the growing pressure. I want to meet with the journalists who are still willing to cover this story. We need to get ahead of the narrative before they can bury us. I'm already on it, Carl replied. I've lined up a meeting with a few trusted reporters. But Marcus, this won't be easy. We're talking about some powerful people here. They'll stop at nothing to protect their interests. I know, Marcus said, but we're not just fighting for justice anymore. We're fighting for the future of this town. If we back down now, they'll continue to control everything. It's time to bring this to light, once and for all. The following days were a blur of covert meetings and late-night phone calls. Marcus and Carl worked tirelessly, connecting with reporters who had the courage to expose the truth. They also began to gather more evidence, surveillance footage, documents, and testimonies from witnesses who had been too afraid to come forward before. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the threats escalated. Marcus's office was broken into late one night, the files he had painstakingly compiled scattered across the floor. His car was vandalized with threatening messages, and he found himself followed wherever he went. He had always known this fight would come with a price, but the reality of it was starting to sink in. One night, as Marcus was leaving a meeting with a trusted reporter, he was approached by a figure in the shadows. The man stepped into the light, and Marcus immediately recognized him. Bradley, Marcus said, his voice cold. The former officer stood before him, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. You think you've won, don't you? He spat. You've stirred up something you can't control. The people you're dealing with, they're not like you. They'll destroy everything you've built. They'll ruin you, just like they ruined me. Marcus stood tall, his gaze unwavering. You're the one who ruined yourself, Bradley. This isn't about me. This is about you and the people who've been using their power to hurt others. I'm not going to let them get away with it. Bradley laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. You have no idea what you're up against. You're just a man, and they don't care about the law. They care about control. They will do whatever it takes to maintain it. I'm not afraid of them, Marcus replied, his voice steady. And neither are the people who've been silenced for far too long. Bradley's face twisted in a grimace. You will be, mark my words. With that, Bradley turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Marcus standing alone, the weight of the warning settling heavily on his shoulders. The battle was no longer just about corruption. It had become a fight for survival. As Marcus walked back to his car, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had made it this far, but the cost of exposing the truth was becoming painfully clear. The fight had escalated, and the forces working against him were more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But Marcus was determined. He had already lost too much to stop now, and if the price of truth was high, he was ready to pay it. Because in the end, it wasn't just his life at stake. It was the future of Maplewood itself.